When I returned home, the land felt wrong. The air was too open, the horizon too empty, and the silence carried a kind of violence I couldn't name yet. What should have been standing for generations was gone, erased in my absence, replaced by churned earth and arrogance. Someone had crossed a line they could never uncross. If you believe power should never be abused, and that karma always finds its way back to those who misuse authority, subscribe now. These stories aren't just about HOA rules or neighborhood drama. They're about justice, consequences, and what happens when the wrong person is pushed too far. The drive back should have felt familiar, but something was already off before I reached the gate. The road curved the same way it always had, but the view beyond it felt stripped, as if the land had been edited without permission. The trees stood where they belonged, the fence lines still traced the property, yet my eyes kept searching for a shape that wasn't there. The absence pressed harder than any visible damage ever could. I stepped out of the vehicle and the wind carried dust instead of the faint scent of old wood. That was when it settled in my chest, heavy and cold. The barn was gone. Not damaged, not partially torn down, not waiting for repair. Gone in the most final sense. Where solid beams in history once stood, there was only scraped earth and tire scars pressed deep into the soil. The barn had been older than the subdivision that crept toward my land. It had survived storms, seasons, neglect, and time. It had been registered, documented, and protected. It was not an abandoned structure or an eyesore. It was a boundary, a statement, and a reminder that this land had a past long before an HOA ever imagined control. I walked the perimeter slowly, every step measured. The ground still showed the marks of heavy machinery. Tracks cut into the dirt like signatures left by someone who assumed permission they never had. Splintered wood lay scattered, broken pieces pushed aside as if they were nothing more than trash. Each fragment felt personal, like a page torn from a book that couldn't be rewritten. The silence around me wasn't peaceful. It felt deliberate, as though the land itself was waiting. No warning signs remained. No notices. No explanation posted. Just destruction completed with confidence and finality. This wasn't an accident. It was a decision. The HOA had always treated my property like an inconvenience. My land didn't match their clean lines or uniform rules. The barn didn't fit their image of manicured sameness. Complaints had been filed before, thinly veiled as concerns about safety and aesthetics. Every time, the law had been clear. The barn stayed. I had been away for official duties, unreachable by design. That absence had been exploited. Someone had decided that silence meant surrender. Someone believed authority could be invented if it was asserted loudly enough. The machinery didn't arrive quietly, and it didn't leave remorse behind. I stood at the center of what remained and listened. The wind moved through the open space where walls once broke it. The sound carried farther now, exposed and raw. It felt like standing in a courtroom after the verdict had already been delivered without a trial. This wasn't about a structure anymore. It was about entitlement. It was about power assumed without consequence. The kind of power people believe exists when they think no one is watching and no one important will care enough to respond. I didn't rage. I didn't shout. The reaction they might have expected never came. Instead, something quieter and far more dangerous settled in. Clarity. The kind that sharpens focus and strips emotion down to purpose. Every detail mattered now. The depth of the tracks. The angle of the scrape marks. The way debris had been pushed toward the tree line rather than hauled away. This had been rushed but confident, executed by people who believed paperwork could be created after the fact if it was needed at all. The neighborhood beyond my property looked unchanged, roofs aligned neatly, streets untouched. Life continued there as if nothing had happened. That contrast made the violation sharper. What was erased here had been invisible to them, and therefore irrelevant in their minds. I took one last look at the open ground and committed it to memory exactly as it was. Evidence doesn't just live on paper. It lives in context, in silence, and in the assumptions people make when they believe they're untouchable. I left without confronting anyone. Not yet. There would be no dramatic entrance, no immediate accusations. Justice doesn't rush. It waits, gathers, and moves when the moment is right. As I drove away, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the empty foundation. The land looked calm again, deceptively so. What had been destroyed could not be undone, but what had been revealed was far more valuable. Someone in that HOA believed they had won. They had no idea who was about to respond. The next morning arrived without ceremony, but the weight of what had happened followed me like a shadow. I didn't return to the empty foundation immediately. Instead, I let distance do what anger never should. From afar, perspective sharpens. From silence, patterns emerge. The HOA office sat at the center of the subdivision like a quiet nerve hub, plain brick, neutral colors, intentionally unremarkable. It was designed to project order, not power. But power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it grows in the absence of resistance, fed by routine approvals and unchecked confidence. That was the kind of power I suspected had been exercised on my land. I parked across the street, not close enough to be noticed, not far enough to miss details. People came and went carrying folders, coffee cups, the casual posture of those who believed their authority was mundane and unquestioned. No one moved like someone who expected consequences. That told me more than any document ever could. This wasn't a rogue contractor misunderstanding boundaries. It was organized, planned, signed off by someone who believed the HOA's reach extended wherever their opinions landed. Somewhere in that building, a decision had been framed as necessary, overdue, or for the good of the community. Those phrases are dangerous when paired with certainty. I didn't go inside. Not yet. Instead, I reviewed the timeline. Complaints had escalated over months, growing sharper in tone. Warnings had been requested and denied. Appeals had failed not because the barn violated any rule, but because persistence had been mistaken for legitimacy. The louder voice had been mistaken for the lawful one. The HOA president had been particularly vocal. Her name appeared frequently, always attached to language about property values and visual harmony. She had a habit of speaking in absolutes, of referring to our land and our standards, even when records said otherwise. That kind of language isn't accidental. It's how people rehearse ownership before acting on it. I knew her reputation. Everyone in the area did. She was efficient, relentless, and confident to the point of recklessness. She believed rules were tools, not boundaries. She believed authority belonged to those bold enough to wield it. And she believed no one important enough would ever push back. The demolition hadn't been quiet. Equipment rentals leave records. Contractors file invoices. Permits are requested or ignored. Silence in those areas doesn't erase the act, it only exposes intent. Someone had authorized destruction without securing the foundation of legality beneath it. What struck me most wasn't the boldness. It was the calm afterward. No attempt to notify me. No letter of explanation. No post-demolition citation taped to the fence. That meant they were waiting. Waiting for outrage, confusion, or resignation. Waiting for me to accept the loss as irreversible. I returned to the land in the afternoon. The sun was higher now, illuminating every detail with unforgiving clarity. Neighbors stood at a distance, pretending to admire gardens or check mail while watching me from the corners of their vision. News had spread, but no one knew the whole story. They rarely do at this stage. I walked the boundary line slowly, re-establishing what had always been clear. Stakes hadn't moved. Surveys hadn't changed. The barn hadn't encroached. The only thing altered was the confidence of someone who thought enforcement didn't require permission. I could almost imagine the meeting. A room full of nodding heads. A confident voice assuring everyone the structure was non-compliant. A vote taken quickly, without dissent, without legal review. Decisions feel easier when everyone present wants the same outcome. They hadn't asked the right questions. They hadn't asked who owned the land beyond the barn. They hadn't asked why previous enforcement attempts failed. And most importantly, they hadn't asked who I was beyond a name on a deed. That omission wasn't accidental. It was convenient. Power thrives on assumptions. It grows when people believe titles exist only within their walls. The HOA believed itself sovereign within the subdivision, immune to scrutiny from beyond its carefully maintained borders. They believed escalation only went upward when they chose it. As I stood there, a truck slowed on the road, its driver glancing toward the empty space before moving on. Curiosity without intervention. That, too, is how authority is sustained. Silence from witnesses. Distance from responsibility. I didn't make calls that day. I didn't send emails. I let the assumption linger. Let the HOA believe their act had gone unanswered. Let confidence solidify into something harder to dismantle. Because when people believe they're safe, they leave trails. They speak freely. They document poorly. They relax. The barn was gone, but the case was just beginning. And somewhere behind those neutral brick walls, someone was already rehearsing excuses, unaware that every assumption they'd made was about to be tested against a system far less forgiving than their own. I left the land again as evening approached. The shadows stretched longer this time, crossing the empty foundation like bars. The scene looked temporary now, no longer final. Destruction had exposed more than it erased. They thought authority was something they could claim. They were about to learn the difference between assumed power and real jurisdiction. Silence became my ally over the next few days. The kind of silence that convinces people nothing is coming. I let it stretch deliberately, knowing that confidence grows fastest when unchallenged. Somewhere inside the HOA, relief was settling in. The barn was gone. The problem, they assumed, was solved. That was when records started talking. Paper never lies, but it does reveal who was careless. Requests, approvals, invoices, and omissions form a language of their own. I began with public filings, the ones people assume no one ever reads. Equipment permits were missing. Emergency authorizations had not been issued. No safety violation had been logged with the county. That absence was louder than any written justification. The demolition contractor was a local company, frequently used by the HOA for minor projects. Fences, signage, sidewalk repairs. Nothing on the scale of what had happened on my land. Their records showed a rush order, paid at a premium, scheduled during a narrow window that aligned perfectly with my absence. Expedience leaves fingerprints. I followed the trail slowly, methodically, letting each piece lead to the next. Internal HOA communications were not public, but patterns emerge even without direct access. Meeting agendas listed nuisance structure resolution. The wording was intentionally vague. No parcel numbers. No owner names. Vagueness is how responsibility is diluted. Financial disclosures told another story. Funds had been reallocated quietly, drawn from a reserve intended for emergency maintenance. Demolition was not maintenance. Someone had decided the definition could bend if no one objected loudly enough. What struck me most was the confidence reflected in the paperwork. No legal review requested. No consultation with county zoning. No recorded attempt to contact the property owner. The decision had been framed as inevitable rather than debatable. That framing only works when dissent is considered irrelevant. I returned to the subdivision in the early evening, when lights came on and routines softened. People are more visible then, more relaxed. Conversations drift across driveways. Windows glow. Authority blends into normalcy. It's where entitlement feels most natural. I watched from a distance as HOA board members gathered for what appeared to be an informal meeting. No posted agenda. No public notice. Laughter carried faintly through an open window. There was no tension in their posture, no sign of concern. The matter was closed in their minds. That was the moment it became clear how far they had overreached. They hadn't acted out of fear or urgency. They had acted out of irritation. The barn offended their vision of order. It stood as proof that not everything bent to their rules. Removing it wasn't enforcement. It was erasure. The law is patient with mistakes. It is ruthless with intent. I reviewed property records again, not because I doubted them, but because repetition exposes how obvious violations truly are. The barn was registered as a historic agricultural structure. Protected. Documented. Exempt from HOA authority by language so clear it bordered on redundancy. Anyone who read it would understand. Anyone who ignored it did so deliberately. I imagined the moment the decision was made. A confident assertion. A dismissive wave at legal nuance. Someone saying they'd handle it later if questions came up. That kind of thinking only exists when consequences feel abstract. The next piece came from the contractor's side. A routine compliance audit revealed something they hadn't noticed. The authorization signature did not match any recorded county official. It matched an HOA board member. Authority impersonated through familiarity. That single detail shifted everything. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't overzealous enforcement. It was unauthorized destruction carried out under the false pretense of jurisdiction. The kind of act that collapses under scrutiny the moment someone knowledgeable decides to look closely. Still, I didn't confront them. Not yet. Instead, I let the assumption persist that the act had gone uncontested. Let confidence deepen. Let casual conversations replace caution. People talk differently when they think they're safe. They embellish. They justify. They forget who might be listening. The neighborhood began to absorb the absence of the barn as a new normal. Some approved. Some felt uneasy. None spoke openly. Collective silence doesn't equal agreement. It equals uncertainty. I stood once more at the edge of the empty foundation as night fell. The ground looked darker now, the scars less visible but no less present. Destruction doesn't disappear. It just waits to be acknowledged. Every document I reviewed added weight, not to anger, but to inevitability. This was no longer personal. It was procedural. And procedure, when followed correctly, does not miss its mark. The HOA believed the matter was finished. That belief was the final error. Because when authority forgets its limits, the response doesn't come as outrage. It comes as a reckoning, quiet at first, and then impossible to ignore. By the end of the week, the neighborhood had adjusted to the absence. Human nature adapts quickly when inconvenience is removed. The barn's shadow no longer crossed the road at dusk. The complaints had stopped. The HOA board moved on to other matters, convinced they had resolved a problem without resistance. That conviction hardened into something more dangerous than arrogance. It became precedent. I watched it unfold from the edges. Not as an observer removed from consequence, but as someone studying how power behaves when it believes itself validated. Small changes appeared first. Notices went out with firmer language. Fines increased without explanation. Enforcement took on a sharper tone, less cautious, more declarative. Authority grows bold when it assumes compliance is permanent. The HOA president became more visible. She stood taller during inspections, lingered longer during conversations, spoke with the confidence of someone who believed the rules bent toward her will. People deferred to her now, not because she was right, but because resistance felt futile. That is how influence metastasizes, quietly, through habit rather than law. I knew that posture well. I had seen it in other arenas, in other cases, where a little power had been mistaken for immunity. The pattern never changed. First came certainty, then expansion, then the assumption that oversight was optional. It always ended the same way. I returned to the land again, this time during one of the HOA's scheduled walks. Board members moved in a cluster, clipboards in hand, voices low but assured. When they reached my property line, they slowed. Not with concern, but with satisfaction. The open space suited them. It looked compliant. No one crossed the boundary. They didn't need to. In their minds, the decision had already been ratified by silence. The absence of challenge had become confirmation. That belief settled visibly across their faces, relaxed and self-assured. I stayed out of sight, listening as comments drifted across the distance. Remarks about improvement, about consistency, about how these things work better when people don't fight them. No one mentioned permits. No one mentioned ownership. No one mentioned legality. They spoke like victors recounting an easy campaign. That was the moment I understood how completely they had misjudged the situation. They believed escalation required noise. That authority is challenged loudly, publicly, emotionally. They had prepared for confrontation, not for scrutiny. They expected outrage, not procedure. They expected a complaint, not a case. Behind that confidence sat a fragile structure of assumptions. That no one with real leverage would care. That consequences lived outside their jurisdiction. That the systems beyond the HOA moved slowly enough to be irrelevant. They were wrong on every count. I spent that afternoon assembling what would eventually be submitted, but not yet. Timing mattered. The sequence of actions would define the outcome. Too early, and they would retreat into caution. Too late, and evidence could disappear. The balance had to be exact. The barn's registration documents sat neatly organized. Photographs taken years earlier showed it intact, solid, unmistakably present. Recent satellite images confirmed the sudden absence. The contrast was stark, undeniable. Time-stamped reality doesn't argue. It presents. I added sworn statements from neighbors who had seen the machinery arrive. They hadn't intervened, but memory lingers even when action does not. Their accounts aligned, forming a quiet chorus of confirmation. Dates. Times. Company logos. None of it flattering. The contractor's records completed the picture. Payment authorization. Scheduling notes. The signature that never should have been there. That single mark connected intent to action. It transformed negligence into responsibility. Still, I waited. The HOA announced a small celebration that weekend, a community gathering meant to highlight recent improvements. The timing was almost poetic. They would stand together, publicly affirming their authority, unaware that every assertion added weight to what was coming. I attended briefly, not as a participant, but as a presence. Faces registered recognition, then dismissal. They saw a landowner, not a threat. The president met my eyes once, her expression unreadable, confident. She nodded, a gesture of closure. A silent suggestion that the matter was settled. I returned the nod. Neutral. Finality misunderstood. That night, I reviewed everything one last time. Not because I doubted the facts, but because precision is respect for the process. The law doesn't reward haste. It rewards clarity. By morning, the submission would be ready. The mechanism that transforms certainty into consequence would be engaged. It would move quietly at first, as it always does. No sirens. No announcements. Just notifications, requests, and questions that demand answers. The HOA slept peacefully, satisfied with its victory. The neighborhood enjoyed the open view. Life moved forward, unaware that a line had been crossed that could not be uncrossed. And somewhere between confidence and complacency, the reckoning took shape. Because when authority forgets who it answers to, the correction never arrives with drama. It arrives with jurisdiction. The submission went out at dawn, not with fanfare, but with precision. Forms filed through channels the HOA had never considered relevant. Attachments labeled carefully. References cited without commentary. The kind of filing that doesn't accuse, doesn't threaten, and doesn't warn. It simply activates a process designed to function without emotion. By mid-morning, the first acknowledgement arrived. Not a response, not an opinion, just confirmation of receipt. That single line carried more weight than any confrontation ever could. It meant the matter was no longer local. It had moved beyond committees and votes and informal authority. It had entered a system that measured actions against statutes rather than preferences. I returned to my property and waited. The land looked unchanged, still open, still scarred, but now it felt different. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was occupied by momentum. Processes had begun turning, slowly but inevitably. The kind that cannot be hurried and cannot be stopped once engaged. The HOA did not notice at first. Their world remained small, bounded by newsletters and scheduled meetings. Power, when unexamined, becomes insular. They continued issuing notices, collecting fines, enforcing rules with renewed certainty. The barn's absence had emboldened them. They believed they had proven something. Then the questions started. A request for documentation landed in the HOA's inbox late in the afternoon. Neutral language. Narrow scope. A simple inquiry regarding authorization for recent demolition activity within a specific parcel. No accusations. No conclusions. Just a request that assumed records existed. That assumption alone unsettled them. The president called an emergency meeting that evening. Not publicly announced. Not recorded. The tone shifted from celebratory to defensive. Confidence gave way to urgency, urgency to confusion. They searched for files that had never been created. They debated interpretations that had never been verified. They realized, too late, that authority asserted without foundation collapses under inquiry. I watched from a distance as lights burned late in the HOA office. Cars came and went. Voices carried through open windows, sharper now, strained. The certainty that once unified them fractured into competing narratives. Who approved it? Why it was urgent? Who said it was allowed? Responsibility began to scatter. The next morning brought another request, this one broader. Contractor agreements. Payment authorizations. Communication records. The scope widened methodically, not aggressively. Each question revealed the absence beneath it. Silence in documentation is not neutral. It is evidence. The HOA president issued a statement to residents framing the inquiry as routine. A misunderstanding. A review. Language chosen to soothe rather than inform. But reassurance only works when confidence remains intact. This time, it didn't. Rumors moved faster than official notices. Neighbors whispered about investigators. About permits. About fines that might not hold up. The open space where the barn once stood no longer looked like an improvement. It looked like a liability. By the third day, the contractor had been contacted directly. Their cooperation was immediate. Businesses understand risk better than volunteers. Records were produced. Invoices forwarded. Emails surfaced. The signature reappeared, clear and unmistakable. Authority assumed. Authority misused. The HOA attempted to regain control by issuing internal directives. Silence. No statements. No further action. But restraint after excess doesn't erase the excess. It highlights it. The sudden halt drew more attention than continued enforcement ever could. I received notice that the matter had escalated. Jurisdiction clarified. Oversight expanded. The language remained neutral, procedural, precise. That was the most telling part. No one was asking whether the demolition should have happened. They were asking how it was allowed to happen at all. I returned to the empty foundation one more time. The ground felt firmer now, less like a wound and more like a record. The absence had become a marker, not of loss, but of exposure. The land hadn't changed. The perception of it had. The HOA president appeared at the property line that afternoon, alone this time. Her posture was different. Shoulders tight. Movements restrained. She did not cross the boundary. She did not speak. She stood, looking at the open space as if seeing it for the first time. Authority looks smaller when it realizes it's being measured. The following days brought formal notices. Not public yet, but unavoidable. Requests that carried deadlines. Consequences implied by statute rather than tone. The HOA's legal counsel entered the picture late, too late to shape the narrative. Their role shifted immediately from defense to mitigation. Residents received updates framed carefully, but the damage to credibility had already begun. Trust erodes quickly when power is revealed as fragile. Questions surfaced about other decisions, other fines, other assumptions. The barn had been the catalyst, but it wasn't the only concern anymore. I remained absent from the discourse. No statements. No explanations. Silence, when paired with process, becomes authority of its own. The system did not require my commentary. It required compliance. By the end of the week, the HOA's confidence had evaporated. Meetings were cancelled. Notices rescinded. The neighborhood settled into a tense quiet, aware that something irreversible had been set in motion. Jurisdiction had asserted itself, not loudly, but completely. The boundary between assumed power and actual authority had been drawn with clarity that could not be argued. And for the first time since the barn was destroyed, the HOA understood the scale of what they had done. They just didn't yet understand who had brought it to their door. By the following Monday, the neighborhood felt different. Not visibly, not structurally, but emotionally. Conversations stopped when doors opened. Curtains shifted more often. The easy rhythm of authority had been replaced by uncertainty, and uncertainty unsettles people who are used to being told what to do. The HOA office no longer projected quiet order. It looked defensive now, lights on at odd hours, blinds partially drawn. Notices that once appeared confidently on bulletin boards were absent. The silence wasn't strategic anymore. It was reactive. Formal correspondence arrived with increasing frequency. Each letter carried the same tone, restrained, factual, unyielding. Requests became directives. Deadlines replaced suggestions. Jurisdiction, once abstract, had become immediate. The HOA was no longer managing perception. It was responding to scrutiny. Board members began resigning quietly. No announcements, no explanations, just names removed from letterhead and meeting rosters. People who once voted confidently now wanted distance. Responsibility, when it becomes real, has a way of thinning crowds. The president remained, at least publicly. Her name still appeared on documents, but the language attached to it softened. Assertions became conditional. Authority became procedural. The shift was unmistakable. Confidence had been replaced by caution, and caution by fear. Residents began receiving amended notices. Fines reversed. Warnings retracted. Language once framed as final was now described as provisional. Every correction carried an implicit admission. Power had been exercised improperly, and now it was being unwound piece by piece. The barn's absence resurfaced in conversation, no longer as an improvement but as the origin point of everything unraveling. People spoke about it carefully, as if the ground itself were listening. The open space had become symbolic, a reminder that authority could destroy, but also expose itself in the process. I received confirmation that the matter had entered a formal review phase. That phrase carried weight. It meant testimony. It meant records preserved. It meant decisions evaluated not by intention, but by impact. The kind of process that does not hurry, because it does not need to. The contractor issued a statement distancing themselves from authorization. They emphasized reliance on representations made by the HOA. Liability, once assumed to be shared, was now being redirected. Everyone involved began searching for an exit that did not exist. The HOA's legal counsel requested time, extensions, clarifications. Their role was no longer to argue righteousness, but to minimize damage. That shift alone revealed how completely the narrative had collapsed. I returned to the land again, not out of habit, but out of closure. The open foundation no longer felt like a loss. It felt like a ledger entry, marked and waiting. The wind moved across it without resistance, carrying dust and the faint echoes of activity that had once taken place there. Neighbors approached cautiously now. Not to accuse, not to defend, but to understand. Questions hovered without being asked. People wanted to know how this had happened, how it could have been prevented, how far the consequences would reach. I offered no answers. The process would provide them soon enough. The HOA president finally crossed the boundary one afternoon. Not physically, but symbolically. She sent a letter. Carefully worded. Regret expressed without admission. Responsibility deflected without denial. It was the language of someone who understood the stakes but not yet the scale. The review continued. Documents were compiled into narratives the HOA could no longer control. Timelines aligned. Decisions were traced back to individuals rather than committees. Authority was no longer collective. It was specific. Residents received notice of a special meeting, this one publicly announced, recorded, and supervised. Attendance was mandatory. Silence was no longer an option. The community gathered not to celebrate improvements, but to witness accountability. The atmosphere inside that room was heavy. Familiar faces avoided eye contact. Former confidence had drained from the space, replaced by unease. Authority, when stripped of illusion, looks ordinary. Vulnerable. Human. Statements were read. Findings summarized. Language remained measured, but the meaning was unmistakable. Unauthorized action. Exceeded jurisdiction. Destruction of protected property. Consequences outlined without drama. The president's name appeared frequently, not as an accusation, but as a fact. Decisions were attributed. Signatures referenced. The room absorbed each detail in silence. When the meeting ended, no one applauded. No one spoke. People left slowly, as if the weight of realization had altered gravity itself. Outside, the neighborhood felt smaller, less certain. The rules that once seemed absolute now looked negotiable, contingent on oversight rather than assumption. Authority had been returned to its proper scale. The barn was still gone. Nothing would change that. But its absence had triggered something larger than replacement. It had exposed a structure built on confidence rather than consent. As evening settled, the lights in the HOA office went dark earlier than usual. The building no longer felt like a center of power. It felt like an office again, subject to rules it could not rewrite. Consequences had arrived, not as punishment, but as correction. The kind that does not seek revenge, only balance. And somewhere in that quiet neighborhood, the realization took hold that authority, once questioned, never looks the same again. The notice arrived without ceremony, folded into an envelope that carried no emotion and no explanation. It didn't need either. Its presence alone changed everything. The review had reached its conclusion, and the next phase required something the HOA could no longer avoid: acknowledgement. The special hearing was scheduled for midweek, early enough that excuses would sound thin, late enough that rumors would have time to ferment. By then, the neighborhood already knew the outcome would not be quiet. People sensed it in the way officials moved, in the careful distance maintained by those who once stood confidently at the center of every decision. The room chosen for the hearing was larger than necessary, intentionally so. Space creates perspective. It reminds everyone present that authority does not belong to the loudest voice, but to the process itself. Chairs were arranged in rows, not circles. This was not a discussion. It was a reckoning. The HOA board arrived early, subdued, folders clutched tighter than usual. Their posture betrayed what words could not. They were no longer in control of the narrative. They were participants in it, subject to evaluation rather than authorship. Residents filtered in quietly, taking seats with cautious curiosity. This wasn't entertainment. It was exposure. The kind that makes people reassess what they've tolerated, what they've ignored, and what they've assumed was normal. When the proceedings began, the tone was precise and restrained. Findings were presented sequentially, each one building upon the last. Unauthorized demolition. Failure to verify jurisdiction. Misrepresentation of authority. Financial misuse. The language remained clinical, but the implications landed heavily. The barn was referenced not as a grievance, but as a fact pattern. Its removal was described in terms of actions taken, rules bypassed, and consequences triggered. Emotion had no place here. The truth didn't need it. As the findings progressed, something shifted in the room. Attention sharpened. People leaned forward. The story they thought they knew was being reframed, not as neighborhood drama, but as institutional failure. Then came the clarification. The matter had escalated beyond administrative review. Oversight had been transferred. Jurisdiction confirmed. The consequences outlined were no longer hypothetical. They were procedural and binding. At that point, the question of identity became unavoidable. The presiding official addressed it calmly, almost casually. The review, they explained, had been conducted with full transparency, independent of any party's status or position. The findings stood on their own merit. But the reporting party's role, previously irrelevant, had now become necessary to disclose. The room held its breath without realizing it. The name was read aloud, accompanied by a title that did not belong in HOA discourse. It didn't fit the room. It didn't fit the assumptions. It didn't fit the narrative anyone had constructed. The reaction was immediate, though contained a ripple of disbelief moved through the chairs. Heads turned instinctively. Eyes searched faces, recalibrating memory. The landowner they had dismissed, the absence they had rationalized, the silence they had interpreted as weakness, all collapsed into a single realization. The HOA president's composure fractured visibly. Not dramatically, but unmistakably. Shoulders tightened. Hands stilled. The confidence she had worn like armor finally slipped, revealing uncertainty beneath. The disclosure wasn't framed as leverage. It wasn't introduced as a threat. It was stated as context, nothing more. The implication, however, was inescapable. This had never been a matter of influence. It had been a matter of jurisdiction from the beginning. And the HOA had trespassed into a domain that does not tolerate assumption. The proceedings continued without pause. Sanctions outlined. Authority curtailed. Oversight mandated. Structural reforms required. Each measure was specific, enforceable, and final. The president was instructed to step aside pending further review. Her authority, once absolute within the subdivision, was suspended with a sentence that carried no malice, only inevitability. Residents absorbed the information in silence. Shock gave way to clarity. The barn's destruction had not been an isolated event. It had been a symptom. And now the cause had been exposed. No one spoke as the hearing concluded. There was nothing left to argue. The process had spoken, and its voice did not invite debate. Outside, the afternoon light felt different. Sharper. More honest. Conversations resumed slowly, cautiously, as people recalibrated their understanding of power and proximity. The neighborhood felt smaller now, but also safer. The HOA office stood quiet in the distance, no longer a symbol of control, but of limitation. Authority had been returned to its proper scale, defined not by confidence, but by consent and law. The barn was still gone. That truth remained unchanged. But its absence had revealed something far more enduring. The silence that followed was not empty. It was resolved. The days after the hearing passed with an unfamiliar calm. Not relief, not celebration, but a steadiness that hadn't existed before. The neighborhood moved differently now, as if everyone had learned to measure their steps again. Authority no longer hovered in the air. It had weight, shape, and limits. Official notices followed, precise and final. The HOA's powers were formally reduced, its enforcement protocols rewritten under supervision. Decisions once made behind closed doors now required transparency, documentation, and review. What had been assumed authority was replaced with accountable governance. The transformation was not dramatic. It was structural, and therefore permanent. The former president did not return. Her absence was noted quietly, without commentary. Power rarely leaves loudly when it is removed lawfully. It simply disappears, leaving behind an outline of where it once stood. People adjusted quickly. They always do when certainty replaces fear. Restitution became the next phase. Not symbolic, not emotional, but tangible. The HOA was ordered to compensate for the unauthorized demolition, not as punishment, but as correction. Funds were allocated. Insurance was triggered. The cost spread across budgets that once funded control rather than care. Accountability has a way of redistributing priorities. The empty foundation on my land became a point of discussion, no longer whispered, no longer avoided. Neighbors stopped to look at it openly now, not with judgment, but with understanding. It wasn't just missing wood and beams. It was evidence. A reminder of how easily power can be misused when left unchecked. I chose not to rebuild the barn immediately. That decision surprised some, confused others. But restoration isn't always about replacement. Sometimes it's about letting the ground settle, letting meaning take root before structure returns. The land would decide what came next, not urgency or pressure. The neighborhood meeting held weeks later felt different from all the ones before it. There were no raised voices, no declarations, just questions, answers, and a shared awareness that systems only work when people remain willing to question them. Authority had been humanized, and that made it manageable. Children played near the open field again, their laughter crossing boundaries that rules once tried to police. Life resumed, not as it had been, but as it should have been all along. The tension that once underpinned every interaction had lifted, replaced by something quieter and more durable. The process concluded formally with a final report, its language clear and unemotional. Findings closed. Actions recorded. Oversight scheduled. The system moved on, as it always does, carrying lessons forward whether anyone asks it to or not. I stood at the edge of the property one last time, watching the sun lower over the trees. The light caught the uneven ground, highlighting scars that would eventually fade. The wind moved freely now, unbroken by walls, carrying with it the sense that something had ended cleanly. This had never been about winning. It had been about restoring balance. About reminding a small system that it exists within a larger one, and that confidence without consent is not authority. It is liability. The barn would return someday, perhaps in a different form. Or perhaps something else would rise there, shaped by the lessons learned rather than the damage done. Either way, the land remained mine, protected not by silence, but by clarity. The HOA continued on, chastened but intact. That mattered. Institutions don't need to be destroyed to be corrected. They need boundaries. They need oversight. They need reminders that power is borrowed, not owned. Neighbors greeted each other more openly now. Conversations lasted longer. Decisions were questioned politely, rather than obeyed automatically. The culture had shifted in ways no rulebook could mandate. Awareness had taken root, and it would not be easily undone. The story spread beyond the subdivision, retold not as gossip, but as caution. A reminder that authority is not defined by titles or confidence, but by jurisdiction and accountability. That silence does not equal surrender. And that patience, when paired with process, is formidable. As evening settled, the land felt whole again, even without the structure that once stood there. The absence no longer felt like loss. It felt like resolution. Somewhere in the distance, lights came on across the neighborhood, steady and unremarkable. Life moved forward, informed by what had happened, shaped by what had been learned. The dust had settled. Not because nothing remained, but because everything that needed to surface finally had. And in that quiet, the truth endured. Power only exists where it is allowed, and justice does not require anger to arrive, only certainty, restraint, and time.